Mr. Arthur Watts taught art at Kingston Art School in the 1960s. He was a strict teacher who believed students needed brutal honesty to succeed. In 1963, he called 18-year-old Eric Clapton into his office. Eric was failing his classes, spending all his time with a guitar instead of completing assignments. "Eric, you're wasting everyone's time," Mr. Watts said firmly. "You have no real talent for music. That guitar is a distraction. Either focus on your art studies or leave this school and find something else to do with your life." Eric left that office destroyed. He quit art school the next week. He pursued music, not because he was confident, but because a teacher had told him he couldn't. 52 years later, in June 2015, Eric Clapton returned to Kingston. He was 70 years old, one of the most successful guitarists in history. Mr. Watts was 89, living in a care home near the school. Advanced Alzheimer's. He didn't remember being a teacher, didn't remember Eric Clapton, didn't remember the conversation that had changed a young man's life. Clapton sat with him for 3 hours, played guitar quietly, and realized Mr. Watts had given him the greatest gift a teacher can give. Not encouragement, challenge. Not belief, doubt. The kind of doubt that forces you to prove it wrong. The kind of rejection that makes you choose. Spring 1962. Kingston Art School, Southwest London. Eric Clapton enrolled at 17 years old. His grandparents, who'd raised him, hoped art school would give him direction, a career path, stability. Eric was talented at drawing. He could sketch well, had an eye for composition. Art school seemed like a practical choice. But Eric brought something else to Kingston, a guitar. A cheap acoustic guitar he'd gotten the previous year. And from the moment he arrived at art school, the guitar consumed him. He'd skip classes to practice, sit in empty classrooms playing blues progressions, spend hours learning songs from records instead of completing his assignments. His art suffered, his grades dropped, his instructors grew frustrated. Arthur Watts was 36 years old in 1963. He'd been teaching at Kingston for 8 years. He was known as a demanding but fair instructor. He believed in his students but refused to coddle them. He thought honest assessment, even brutal assessment, was better than false encouragement. Mr. Watts noticed Eric Clapton immediately. The boy had potential as an artist, but was squandering it, always distracted, always thinking about music instead of art, always carrying that guitar. In March 1963, after Eric failed his second major project in a row, Mr. Watts called him into his office. Eric entered nervously. He knew he was failing. He knew he deserved criticism, but he wasn't prepared for what Mr. Watts said. "Eric, sit down. We need to talk about your future here." Eric sat. "You're failing most of your classes. You're not completing assignments. You're distracted constantly. And I know why. It's that guitar. You're spending all your time playing music instead of focusing on your studies." "I'm sorry, sir. I'll do better." "No, you won't, because you don't want to be here. You want to be a musician." Eric didn't know how to respond.
Mr. Watts continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "Eric, I'm going to be honest with you. I've heard you play. I've listened when you sit in empty classrooms. And I need to tell you something important. You have no real talent for music." The words hit Eric like a physical blow. "You play adequately, but adequately isn't enough to make a career. Music is competitive. The people who succeed are exceptionally talented. You're not exceptional. You're distracted from your actual education by something you're not particularly good at." Eric felt his face burning, tears threatening. "That guitar is a distraction from your real potential. You have genuine ability in art. You could have a career as an illustrator or designer, but you're throwing it away for music you'll never be successful at." Mr. Watts leaned forward. "So here's my advice. Either focus completely on your art studies, no more guitar during school hours, no more missed assignments, or leave this school now and find something else to do with your life. Because what you're doing currently isn't working. You're wasting everyone's time, including your own." Eric left that office humiliated, angry, destroyed. That night, he told his grandparents he was quitting art school. "Why?" they asked, concerned. "Because I'm not good at it, and I don't want to be there." "Then what will you do?" "Music." "But Eric, can you make a living at music?" "I don't know, but I'm going to try." His grandparents were disappointed, but didn't stop him. Eric left Kingston Art School in April 1963, and he pursued music, not with confidence, not with encouragement, but with something more powerful, something to prove. A teacher had told him he had no talent, that he'd never succeed, that music was a distraction from his real potential. Eric Clapton spent the next 52 years proving Mr. Watts wrong. He joined the Yardbirds, then Cream, then became one of the most successful solo artists in rock history. He wrote songs that became part of popular culture. He influenced entire generations of guitarists. He won 18 Grammy Awards. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 times, once as a solo artist, once with Cream, once with the Yardbirds. He sold over 100 million albums worldwide.
He became, by any measure, one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. For decades, Clapton carried the memory of Mr. Watts's words, sometimes with anger, sometimes with satisfaction at having proven him wrong, sometimes with bitterness at the teacher who'd tried to crush his dreams. But as Clapton got older, something shifted in how he remembered that conversation. By his 60s, Clapton began to understand Mr. Watts hadn't been trying to destroy him. He'd been trying to force a decision: art or music, school or guitar, comfort or risk. And by forcing that decision, Mr. Watts had saved Clapton's life. If the teacher had been encouraging about music, Clapton might have stayed at art school, might have tried to balance both, might have gotten a safe design job while playing guitar as a hobby, might never have pursued music with the desperate intensity that made him great. The rejection had been necessary. The doubt had been the fuel. The "you'll never succeed" had become the reason to succeed. By the time Clapton was 70, he understood. Mr. Watts had given him a gift. Not the gift of encouragement, the gift of challenge. In June 2015, Clapton returned to Kingston for the first time in 52 years. He didn't announce his visit publicly. He came quietly with his assistant, wanting to see the art school where everything had changed. The school had been renovated, updated, but the bones were the same. He walked the corridors where he'd once carried that cheap guitar, stood in the empty classroom where he'd practiced instead of attending lectures. He asked the administration if anyone knew what had happened to Mr. Arthur Watts. They did. Mr. Watts had retired from teaching in 1987. He was 89 years old now, living in a care home called Riverside Gardens, about 3 miles from the school. "Is he well enough for visitors?" Clapton asked. "He has advanced Alzheimer's," the administrator said gently. "He doesn't remember much, but the home welcomes visitors. It might be nice for him to see a former student, even if he doesn't remember you." Clapton went to Riverside Gardens that afternoon. The facility was clean, bright, well-maintained. The staff was kind. They led Clapton to a common room where several elderly residents sat in comfortable chairs, some watching television, some sleeping, some staring at nothing. Arthur Watts sat by a window. He was thin, his hair white, his face deeply lined. He wore a cardigan and slippers. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, trembling slightly. Clapton approached slowly. "Mr. Watts?" The old man looked up. His eyes were cloudy. He smiled politely but blankly. "Hello, do I know you?" "You taught me a long time ago at Kingston Art School. My name is Eric Clapton." No recognition. Mr. Watts kept smiling politely. "That's nice. Were you a good student?" Clapton smiled sadly. "No, sir. I was terrible. I failed most of my classes." "Oh dear, that's too bad." Mr. Watts seemed sympathetic but distant, like hearing about a stranger's problems.
Clapton sat in the chair next to him. "You called me into your office once, told me I was wasting time with a guitar, that I had no talent for music." Mr. Watts looked confused. "Did I? That doesn't sound very nice of me." "It was honest, and it changed my life." "I don't remember that. I'm sorry. I don't remember much these days." "That's all right. Do you remember teaching at Kingston Art School?" Mr. Watts thought for a long moment. "I taught somewhere. Was it Kingston? I think so. Art. I taught art." He seemed proud of remembering this much. "You did. You were my teacher in 1963. 1963? That's a long time ago." "It is." They sat in silence for a moment. Mr. Watts looked out the window. Clapton looked at this old man who didn't remember him, didn't remember being a teacher, didn't remember the conversation that had defined Eric Clapton's life. "Mr. Watts, I brought my guitar. Would it be all right if I played for you?" "Oh, I'd like that. I enjoy music." Clapton's assistant brought in the acoustic guitar Clapton had carried from the car. Clapton began playing quietly, simple blues progressions, songs from the 1960s that Mr. Watts might have heard when he was younger. Mr. Watts's foot began tapping. He smiled. "That's lovely. You play very well." "Thank you." "Do you play professionally?" "I do. I've been playing for many years." "How wonderful. You must be very talented." Clapton almost laughed. The irony was exquisite. The teacher who'd told him he had no talent now complimenting his playing without knowing who he was. Clapton played for 3 hours that afternoon. Sometimes Mr. Watts listened attentively. Sometimes he dozed. Sometimes he forgot Clapton was there and seemed startled when he noticed the music. But whenever he was present, he smiled and tapped his foot. During a break, Clapton said quietly, "Mr. Watts, I want to thank you for something." "Thank me? What for?"
"In 1963, you told me I wasn't good enough at music to make it a career. You told me to focus on art school or leave. You told me I was wasting everyone's time." Mr. Watts looked concerned. "That sounds harsh. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. You were right to say it." "I was?" "Yes, you forced me to choose art or music, comfort or risk, and I chose music, and that choice defined my entire life. If you'd been encouraging, I might have stayed at art school, might have tried to balance both, might never have committed fully to music. But you rejected me. You told me I'd fail, and that rejection made me determined to prove you wrong." Mr. Watts listened, but didn't seem to fully understand. "I became a musician, Mr. Watts, a successful one. I've spent 52 years playing guitar, and I came here today to say thank you. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for challenging me. Thank you for forcing me to choose." Mr. Watts smiled gently. "I'm glad things worked out for you. You seem like a very nice young man." Clapton realized Mr. Watts would never understand what he was saying. The Alzheimer's had taken too much. The teacher would never know that the failing student he'd rejected had become one of the most famous musicians in the world. And perhaps that was a mercy. Perhaps it was better this way. Clapton played more music. Mr. Watts listened, his eyes closing peacefully. Before leaving, Clapton leaned close and said softly, "You told me I had no talent. You were wrong about that. But you were right that I needed to choose. And by forcing that choice, you saved my life. So thank you, Mr. Watts. Thank you for the rejection. Thank you for the doubt. Thank you for the challenge. They were the greatest gifts a teacher could give." Mr. Watts opened his eyes. "Thank you for the music. It was beautiful." He didn't remember who Eric Clapton was. He didn't remember telling a student he'd never succeed. He didn't remember being the teacher who'd almost ended one of music's greatest careers. But he'd done something more important than remembering. He'd forced a decision, and in that decision, Eric Clapton became who he was meant to be. Arthur Watts passed away in 2017 at age 91. His obituary mentioned he'd been a beloved art teacher at Kingston for 25 years. It didn't mention Eric Clapton. In a 2018 interview, Clapton was asked about influential people in his life. He mentioned several musicians, producers, collaborators. Then he paused and said, "There's one more person, an art teacher named Arthur Watts. In 1963, he told me I had no musical talent and should give up guitar. It was the most devastating moment of my young life. I was crushed. I quit school. I pursued music out of anger and spite, spent decades resenting him."
The interviewer looked surprised. This teacher is influential? Essential. I finally understood, late in life, that he'd given me exactly what I needed. Not encouragement, challenge. He forced me to choose between comfort and risk, between dabbling in music and committing to it. And by rejecting me, he made me determined to prove him wrong. That determination defined my career. Did you ever tell him? I tried. I visited him 2 years before he died. He had Alzheimer's, didn't remember me, didn't remember being a teacher. I played guitar for him for 3 hours, and he smiled and told me I was talented. The irony was beautiful. Do you wish he'd remembered? Wish he'd known how wrong he was? Clapton thought for a long moment. No, I think the universe got it right. He challenged me when I needed challenge, and when I came back to thank him, he couldn't remember, so he couldn't be burdened by guilt or regret. The rejection served its purpose. The forgiveness, or maybe the gratitude, was for me, not him, and that's how it should be. Today, there's a small plaque at Kingston School of Art, as it's now called, that reads, "Eric Clapton, student 1962-1963. Sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who challenge us to prove them wrong." The plaque doesn't mention Mr. Arthur Watts by name, but it could have, because Mr. Watts gave Eric Clapton something no encouraging teacher could have: doubt. And from that doubt, Clapton built certainty. From rejection, he built success. From "you'll never make it," he built a career that lasted 60 years. The teacher who told him he had no talent didn't stop Eric Clapton. He made him. And 52 years later, Eric Clapton understood that and came back to say thank you to a man who couldn't remember, for a gift that couldn't be returned. The gift of challenge, the gift of doubt, the gift of rejection that becomes fuel. Sometimes the people who believe in us help us succeed, but sometimes the people who reject us make us unstoppable.